Well, joining me now in the studio, the writers A.L Kennedy, the Telegraph's literary critic Gaby Wood, and on Skype from Gloucestershire, the writer Ian McEwan. Good evening to you all. First of all, Ian McEwan, what for you was so enriching about his stories?
Well, a translucent quality about the prose itself, an extraordinary experimenter with time, driving myth and fiction into one other sort of unknown and unusual element. He really was one-off, and one would really have to go back to Dickens to find a writer of the very highest literary quality who commanded such extraordinary persuasive powers over whole populations. I mean, it really is an extraordinary phenomenon, his literary career.
You heard that there he said himself that he was a realist, and of course he's been put in this idea that it was about magic realism, but actually wasn't it really just about a lot of the stories that particularly his grandparents told him that he remembered and that really were kind of infused his whole idea of what his fiction would be about?
Well, I mean, people, of course, rightly mention 100 Years of Solitude, but Love in the Time of Cholera, I think, is the masterwork. Mm-hmm. And that is very specific. I mean, in Conradian terms, about the crumbling decrepitude of this Caribbean, Colombian town, unnamed, but something like Cartagena. The heat, the corruption, the swampiness of it all is actually, as you say, named in the way that a reporter would name it. Mm-hmm. So this runs against the current of the magical, but still it's there, that magical element too, and that's what makes him so extraordinary.
I also thought it was amazing that it was only relatively recently that he decided he was going to write his memoirs, and he was just going to take his time, and first one volume, and then of course a long time before the second volume came, and this idea that he was denying that he was ever going to stop writing.
Yes, I mean, there was a sad quality to this because he had a neurodegenerative disease. He was making pronouncements about how he would never stop writing, but in fact he had. So there was an element of tragedy which we will all come to, I guess, at some point or other for ourselves.
Ian, thank you for now. I mean, Ian talks about Love in the Time of Cholera being his favourite, but when you look back at 100 Years of Solitude, translated into 30 languages, and a bestseller for so many years, what was it about that book that really, I mean, it took his writing right round the world?
Well, it comes from a whole set of assumptions that we're not encouraged to have, certainly in this culture or in the London-centred American Hollywood ending type of culture. He truly believes that if you write something, in the way that a journalist would believe, if you write something, if you make something true enough and full enough, it has the capacity to change the world. Mm-hmm. And if you set out on that set of premises, it will, and you will have these incredible swathes of time that you'll encompass and massive casts, and you'll take on all kinds of technical challenges because you believe that you can do it and because you believe that it's worthwhile. Mm-hmm. And you have a definite aim in sight, and there's this huge, beautiful confidence. I mean, when I read him as a student, I wasn't even thinking of writing. It literally blew my mind because he was saying, actually, you can do anything. Your mind can do anything, and within reality, there is a reality which is magic. If you dream that you kiss your boss and you see him in the morning, you look at him differently. That's not unreal. That's to do with a layer of reality that you don't acknowledge, but he did acknowledge it.
Gaby?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think for that reason, it's actually quite a different book in Spanish than it would be in other languages. I think, you know, where he comes from, I'm not even talking about the specificity that Ian mentioned in Love in the Time of Cholera, but I mean even the child with a pig's tail in 100 Years of Solitude, or levitating people. You know, in Colombia, you can quite happily take that as a given. Not necessarily because it actually has happened, but because the folkloric is somehow part of your experience.
Exactly, right? and in the world that we live in today, the folkloric is not really celebrated the way it was, and obviously South America, but in other cultures as well, the folkloric was incredibly important.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, when you look at his influence, and in some ways it's difficult to trace because he had a lot of imitators who weren't so good, but if you imagine his influence perhaps more tangentially, you might think that Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children or Toni Morrison's
And he would
Beloved.
say that, and Beloved, both of those people would actually acknowledge a debt.
Yeah, I think they have. But I think I sort of mean those worlds are very
Yes.
distinct from his, and yet the permission to tell a story in that way was indebted to him.
It's the permission. It's the permission to make something out of absolutely nothing. And I mean, we have this sort of special voice where we say, "Ooh, folkloric." I mean, these are stories that have stood the test of time for centuries. They are extraordinarily good. It's not just I'm going to make up some fan fiction, and if something weird happens, I'll turn someone into a parrot. It's doing something incredibly difficult. If you're not just photocopying reality, you have to explain so much more. And those guys go for it.
Well, Ian McEwan, I mean, you talked earlier about Dickens, but where would you put him in the kind of pantheon of writers?
Well, right at the top. And actually, talking of his influence, I think he had a massive effect, not only of Angela Carter and Salman Rushdie in say, the British literary scene, but I think he loosened us up here in our little corner of northwestern Europe. All kinds of writers who you wouldn't associate with magical realism suddenly were able to break free of a kind of literary provincialism into thinking for themselves of how they might experiment with time, with place, with myth, with fiction, with the interpenetration of all these things. So yes, I would place him right up in the best place in Parnassus, almost of a Shakespearean quality.
And also the other side of his life, you know, the very overt, obviously, opposition to Pinochet, the row with Mario Vargas Llosa, which went on for years and years and years. He was capable of very, very, obstinate, principled behaviour, wasn't he?
Well, he was. I was in Cartagena not so long ago, just 3 or 4 years ago, having dinner with Llosa and talking about that great rupture. And in fact, behind it, I think there was great fondness and great mutual admiration. This was really the battle of giants. And Llosa was often cast, I think, unfairly in the context of Latin American literature as an extreme right-winger. This simply wasn't the case. He had strictures against Castro, and many of which were true. There were writers and journalists in prison in Cuba, and he dared say so. So I think there was a kind of a rather formulaic quality to this discord. And now I think a death will settle this.
Thank you all very much indeed.